Students, this video is meant to give you an introduction to Mary Wollstonecraft. So we are going to look at the PowerPoint as it relates to her. One thing I want to make sure to mention and not forget is that though we are discussing Mary Wollstonecraft in this unit, Unit 1, about the search for truth in the Age of Enlightenment, her legacy lives on in the next unit, the struggle for power and for science, because Wollstonecraft is the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, which we're going to read. And Wollstonecraft was very influential in terms of how her daughter approaches thinking about science and rationality. And the relationship between parents and kids. So she's gonna still be with us when we get into Frankenstein. But what I want to tell you about her for this unit, she lived from 1759 to 1797. She was very much a free spirit on the fringes of society. Her life was considered kind of racy at the time. She had 2 relationships with men before she got married. She had a child out of wedlock. Growing up, her dad was an alcoholic and an abuser. And her sister married an abuser. And Mary Wollstonecraft actually helped her sister escape an abusive marriage. So, she very much saw what we might call today some toxic masculinity. She did have some very rocky relationships with men. And she was also very interested in kind of rethinking the way women and men lived together. At one point, she was in a relationship with a married man, and she proposed to the man's wife that they all 3 just live together. The man's wife did not like that idea, but she was always kind of thinking outside the box and, thinking that she questioned societal structures. And did not feel compelled to always fit inside them. She was British, but she left Great Britain and went to France. She was a radical proponent of the Enlightenment and of the French Revolution when it started. Though, like Duduge, she was alarmed by the rise of the Jacobins and did not agree with how radical the revolution became when led by the Jacobins. She first became famous for writing a pamphlet in which she challenged Edmund Burke, who was a member of Parliament. He had written about the French Revolution and sort of was concerned about it. He thought it would break down society. And in her response to him, she sort of criticized him. She criticized Burke because he sort of criticized the women who were taking such powerful positions in the French Revolution. He called the female protesters during the revolution devils. It's sort of reminiscent of, I don't know how aware all of you were of the protests over the murder of George Floyd. But when those protests were happening, many people said those protests, those people participating in those protests were protesters, and maybe great Americans, standing up to protest a great act, a terrible act of racism. But then other commentators called them, hoodlums or radicals, or used sort of negative terms. That's kind of what Burke did with the women involved in the French Revolution. He called them devils. He saw them as really evil. And Mary Wollstonecraft said, that doesn't really make sense. They're women fighting for humans to have, more power and more rights. And she became famous overnight for criticizing Burke. And 2 years after that, she wrote The Vindication of Rights of Women. We're going to read an excerpt from that in our class. And in that text, it's a little different from Deguche's text. Deguche's text is very much focused on these articles and these things that should exist legally for women, which of course is very important that women have these legal rights. But Mary Wollstonecraft's style in Vindication of Rights of Women is to spend more time really breaking down why women are enslaved and unable to gain equality. So it's not a series of articles like in Deguche's text. It's more, Wollstonecraft was a teacher. She worked as a teacher a lot. And so she was thinking more philosophically. She was thinking about education. She was thinking about how did we end up here? And one thing she really focuses on is property and the ways that property and heredity can be an obstacle to the liberation of women and to women having equal rights. She believed that property and heredity are not good. She says property stops every good disposition before it ripens into virtue. So you might think back at like Kant, when we were talking about Kant. He said it was laziness and cowardliness that keeps people from thinking for themselves and getting educated and pursuing the truth. For Wollstonecraft, what keeps women unequal to men is, if they have a lot of stuff and they're so obsessed with that stuff, today we might call it privilege, that they're kind of in a bubble and it makes them kind of lazy. It kind of makes them, not seek for more. And she says, in what but habitual idleness can hereditary wealth and titles produce? So she's saying we're way too caught up in stuff, and stuff makes us lazy, and it keeps us from being virtuous. When property is inherited, you're obsessed with status, and it's a corrupt system for men and women. Property corrupts us. Wealth and titles make us lazy. She said women should have equal rights. Otherwise women are like lap dogs. I think she calls them, says women are like spaniels, fawning over guys, flattering each other, or a man is flattering over women, but no one's getting anything done really. So we're sort of cushioned by this sort of way in which women are treated like spaniels. And so she believes the money and drive for property is what's ruining people. So that's a little introduction to her. Go ahead and read. Let me see if there's any way. Yeah, there's a little bit more here. I think I've said most of this. Yeah, these problems of property and heredity are stopping everybody from pulling the trigger and jumping into the kind of Kantian, Diderotian, Cartesian models of thinking for ourselves. So Kant said it was laziness and cowardliness that keeps us from thinking for ourselves. Wollstonecraft says, no, it's property and heredity. She says, virtue likewise can only be acquired by the discharge of relative duties, but the importance of these sacred duties will scarcely be felt by the being who is cajoled out of his humanity by the flattery of sycophants. So if you have some man adoring you, maybe you won't even bother to try to get equal rights or think for yourself. While women are absolutely dependent on their husbands, they will be cunning, mean, and selfish. And the men who can be gratified by the fawning fondles of spaniel-like affection have not much delicacy, for love is not to be bought in any sense of the words. Its silken wings are instantly shriveled up when anything besides a return in kind is sought. If we're not going to have equal rights, you can't just buy us with buying us nice clothes or something. Hereditary property sophisticates the mind, it sort of corrupts the mind. And the unfortunate victims to it are unable to see what true happiness is. So she's saying stuff doesn't really make us happy, but it distracts us from what we should really care about, which is virtue and the pursuit of knowledge. Yeah, so those are the things you should look for as you read Wollstonecraft. Let me know if you have any questions.